I think a lot of listeners would agree that when it comes to jazz, drums occupies a special place. When Buddy Rich died, somebody at the New York Times had the bright idea of interviewing Philly Joe Jones, the great bebop drummer, about Buddy Rich. And so we talked about, how great Buddy Rich was and how much of an influence Buddy Rich was. And at the end of the article, Philly gets really excited and he winds it up with this immortal quote where he says, "And if you don't love drums, you don't love jazz." And there's something to that. Drumless bands, peace and love. I've been in many of them and I love that too. But I was around quite a lot of good drummers when I first came to New York, and that was often thanks to a lot of my friends who introduced me to some great drummers that I wound up working with and so on. But I think I mentioned that one of the drummers that we knew well was the great Eddie Locke, who came up on the Detroit scene with Kenny Burrell and Tommy Flanagan and that generation. And in his New York years, of course, played with everybody, and his everybody included, most famously, possibly, Coleman Hawkins. He was also a drummer of choice for everybody from Barry Harris, Tommy Flanagan, and on and on. But Eddie was a protege of Papa Joe Jones, the original drummer on the Decca Basie label. And two other friends of mine, two other great famous drummers that I played with, Ray Mosca of the Oscar Peterson Trio and Dorothy Donegan Trio, and Oliver Jackson of about 8 million jazz gigs with every famous person you can think of, from Johnny Hodges to, well, you name it, Hank Jones. So those three drummers we worked a lot with, and they were all proteges of Papa Joe. And but before that, I had gotten to know Joe Jones. And he used me on gigs, quartet gigs, with Phil Flanagan on bass, and this very quiet, gentlemanly school teacher guy on piano that I don't really remember. It was just a couple gigs. He led the band by playing time on his famous hi-hat sound, and he would just yell out the tune in the key. And it didn't matter if you knew it, it was too late. So that was a little scary, but I think I probably acquitted myself okay. And but Joe was a very complex man, I think. And I didn't know him intimately. I did not go have dinner with Joe Jones. I mean, it was social. We would, hang out, and he would talk at length at the corner at Eddie Condon's, where he would have this orange towel around his neck. He was dressed in a suit, but and he would expound at length on many fascinating topics to these young guys, of whom I was one. He was a very loving and beautiful man who put on a really gruff exterior. Some people even called him crazy, and they meant crazy, not like crazy man, they meant like unwholesome, but that was completely wrong. Joe Jones, he couldn't suffer fools for half a second. Why should he? He's Joe Jones. And I think that was part of it, why he put on this sometimes rather forbidding, kind of nutty exterior. He just didn't want to be bothered. But in real life, the real Joe Jones, no. And in fact, I know this especially because all three of those younger drummers I mentioned, Ray Mosca, Eddie Locke, and Oliver Jackson, separately told me and other people this, that Joe Jones, he died broke because he gave all his money away to people that he cared for. He was one of those guys who, if a jazz widow or a jazz musician was in trouble, health, had no insurance, Joe Jones would just lay cash on people. All those drummers I mentioned, he gave them gigs that he didn't want or wouldn't do or couldn't do. And he was like that. He was very, very generous and beautiful person, and again, like I said, a very deep and complex person with an astounding public personality. His smile, his body language and charisma were unmistakable. You can see him in films, at TV. It's really something, man. You can't take your eyes off this guy. He has super personality. And he was like that in a really wonderful, positive way, I felt. And he was very caring about younger musicians, which, as I said, he certainly didn't have to be. We weren't paying him for lessons. There was nothing in it for him. And around that same time, I also had the wild experience of playing with Sonny Greer, Duke Ellington's great drummer, Elmer Snowden's drummer, if you want to go back a bit. And that's something else. There were players from that crowd and from that generation around New York really, truly thrilling to think about. I mean, I played with Johnny Blowers. Speaking of drummers, for God's sake, he played with Bix. I mean, you were one. What is 1 degree of separation? And that, as anybody, and I know many people who can also say this, including Vince Giordano, about whom there's a film now, that being 1 degree of separation away from people like Bix or Johnny Hodges or Coleman Hawkins was the most we could do. And we were very fortunate to be able to do that. And so, yeah, Sonny Greer played every Sunday at a seafood restaurant on 3rd Avenue called Larson's. The band leader was Brooks Kerr, who's known mostly perhaps as an Ellington scholar and good friend of Duke Ellington's, as were his parents. And Russell Procope was part of it. Harold Ashby, who became a lifelong friend, I'm happy to say, and who I idolized as a player. Procope, another one, extremely interesting man, dauntingly well-educated person with the most beautiful, exquisite manners and the most erudite and precise vocabulary and his bearing and his good looks. Yeah, Russell Procope was one heck of a man. I didn't know him well, but boy, he made an impression. Aaron Bell was the bass player. And of course, what was on the menu was all Ellington and Strayhorn all the time. And that was really thrilling. I got a chance to play some songs that to me seemed obscure at the time that I hadn't had a chance to play because Brooks Kerr and Aaron Bell knew all of those and they helped me learn more of those. And of course, unlike some men and women of that generation, Sonny Greer loved to talk about the old days, and he knew I was a live one. So we would have dinner, and we'd sit. In fact, sometimes we would go across the street to a Chinese restaurant instead of eating at Larson's, where we were working. I guess because Sonny really liked Chinese food. But he would go on at length about stuff that was so much fun. Especially, I'll just say one thing, and I'm sure some of the people out there have heard this before, but one of the things he would return to often was the time when Sidney Bechet played with Elmer Snowden regularly, and the rest of the front line was Irvis and Miley. And Sonny Greer, it was just one of those, talk about, now I really am going good old days. But Sonny Greer would just say, man, that was something. It was never recorded as far as I know, he said, but that was something. To hear, he said, Miley and Bechet would go at each other. Trade choruses, 8s, 4s, the whole thing, until they wound up blowing together, and people were screaming and just coming in from the street because they were hearing this stuff out the door. And as I said, I was a great audience for those kind of tales because Sonny Greer could see how excited I was. And Sonny played fine, man. He played fine. He was up high on that stool with that snare drum up way high, like he played with that funny posture that he had, And his time was fine, and his sound was Sonny Greer, and that was really something. As I said, I mentioned Johnny Blowers. That was another drum. Freddie Moore was around. My goodness, he had played with Bechet. Speaking of Bechet, and I got to meet Freddie through the great banjo player Eddie Davis, and I could do a whole 2 hours on Eddie Davis. But the best person to do that is Eddie Davis. Oh yeah, I had good luck with drummers. A lot of powerful, great players were around, and not least of all, my peer Kenny Washington, who introduced me also to Philly Joe Jones, who I got to talk to, and man, that was fun. I never did play with Philly Joe, and Billy Higgins, who I also, unfortunately for me, never got to play with. But of course, Kenny Washington had gone to drum school, his own drum school, which was the greatest drum school. I mean, he knew everything about everybody. And at that time, we were working together a lot. It was before Kenny got on the radio. And at that time, it's a long story. I actually have a very interesting, rather long anecdote about being at the very beginning of the Marsalis Brothers, because that band, again, that Widespread Depression Orchestra, was produced on CBS by George Butler, who was the Marsalis Brothers producer and, in fact, had been a childhood friend of Alice Marsalis. And he was flying high at Columbia then. He'd been producing a lot of big stuff for them. And he did my band. We're not a success for Columbia. We only made one LP. But his main project at that time was the Marsalis Brothers. So I was around the very beginning of that, thanks partly to my association with George Butler and CBS, and my association with Kenny Washington. And the reason I mentioned Kenny and the Marsalis Brothers is that he was not the drummer with the Marsalis Brothers, as you know, but he was the first drummer with Jazz at Lincoln Center. And, of course, Wynton Marsalis was there as the band leader. And I was there, not playing, but Kenny invited me to what was the dress rehearsal for the first concert they ever gave, which was Such Sweet Thunder, the famous piece by Ellington and Strayhorn, which they performed in its entirety. And so thanks to Kenny, I think I was one of about 3 people who attended that. I don't know why there weren't more people there. But certainly the band was there. And just to briefly, because people don't remember this, and other than referenced tape at the hall, they never recorded, I don't think, with this, which was the first Jazz at Lincoln Center band, where the rhythm section was Kenny, Milt Hinton, and Roland Hanna. Just to remember the saxophone section, it was Norris Turney, who of course had played Hodges' chair while Ellington was alive, and Frank West played the Russell Procope chair, which was a very nice choice, I thought. Jimmy Hamilton played his own chair. Joe Temperley played his own chair. But the surprise that people don't remember, except for the guy who was responsible for it, who I will name, which I found out like 20 years later, my dear friend, a man who I loved and adored in every way, a saxophone player named Harold Ashby, who recorded with quite a lot of big-time blues stars in Chicago. He was from the Midwest. He was born in Kansas City, and he started in Chicago. He recorded with Otis Spann and those kind of people up there. But through a sideways recommendation, and then finally, because he was friends with Ben Webster, he took Ben's chair in Duke's band. And he was one of my favorite people. He lived in the same building, and I used to spend a lot of time with Harold. But now, wait a minute. Now I lost my train of thought. Why did I go off on that?
Such Sweet Thunder. And
oh, yes, right. So Harold Ashby was supposed to play the Paul Gonsalves chair, and he gets a real important solo on Circle of Fourths, an up-tempo screamer. But Harold had his eccentricities, as did quite a lot of musicians, about working, and at the last minute he decided he did not want to play the gig. So they had to grab a substitute for him rather quickly. Who did they get? Joe Henderson. It was a brilliant choice. He was the perfect kind of soloist to do that, because he doesn't sound like Gonsalves, of course, that wasn't the point, but that he had that snaky, harmonically advanced, mysterious, inside and outside, wander and come home kind of system that snaked through this solo on Circle of Fourths. Absolutely brilliant and unforgettable. Years later, I did ask David Berger, the arranger for many years at Jazz at Lincoln Center and for many other projects, I asked Berger, who picked Joe Henderson? And he said it was me. I said, all right. Yeah, so through again, and it was very thrilling to backtrack a little bit from the Lincoln Center thing for me to play with these kind of powerful drummers, because for me, drums in popular music was born in jazz. I mean, Baby Dodds gets credit for inventing the hi-hat, which is a brilliant, genius invention. And the idea that through these drummers themselves created this almost magic hardware engineering feat where one person could do what 3 people did or more. And that not only was not only a question of practicality, but it had something to do with soul and the soul discipline of jazz and other music, because modern music is unthinkable without the drum kit. How could you have rock? How could you have even country music uses drum kit? Punk music, they were against all traditions. They use a drum kit. Come on, the drum kit, just think about it for a second. It's all about the drum kit and the electric guitar. But it was exciting to be around these drummers from when the drums was kind of fresh in popular music. And that was Sonny Greer's generation, really. They were like the first ones. I mean, yes, I knew some people who knew about Civil War drummers, and they worked on Ken Burns' series. This guy, Chuck Spies. I even played some gigs with him, very archaic gigs. So that was still known about too. But that wasn't jazz. That had nothing to do with jazz, really. It was military. But as far as popular music goes, really, the Sousa Band and then the jazz players, the very early days, the teens. And that drum thing, it went everywhere into all musics. Now musics all over the world, even musics that are very old and traditional, now include drum kit. Church, drum kit. I mean, it went everywhere. And it came from jazz. And this is part of my rant, but I'm not the only one, of jazz as the sometimes, or perhaps often, unacknowledged source of most of what's great in 20th century music. I know I'm going out on a limb there. No disrespect to Arnold Schoenberg and the Viennese School or Bartok. They were also important, as was everybody from T-Bone Walker and that whole school. But man, jazz gave so much to so many other musics. And that's another reason why jazz is art music with capital A. I thank you.
I don't think anybody watching will disagree with us. Thank you,
Preaching
Michael.
to the converted.
Of course.